Kia ora koutou katoa no mai haere mai. Hi everyone and welcome to today's webinar. My name's Greta, I'm the media lead at New Zealand Post and I'm really pleased to be your host for today's webinar. So today we're going to be focusing on sustainable packaging and the surprising results we found when we assessed various packaging materials based on their carbon footprint. So with me today are Sam Bridgman, our Senior Environment Specialist at New Zealand Post. Welcome, Sam. And Jeff Vickers, the Technical Director at ThinkStep ANZ, our Sustainability Research Partner. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Jeff.
So Sam and Jeff will talk through our sustainable packaging journey, the research that ThinkStep conducted to assess the carbon footprint of various packaging options, and then our advice if you're assessing your own packaging at the moment. If you have any questions while you're watching the webinar, our team of experts are behind the scenes ready and waiting to answer your questions. You can submit your questions at any time to the right of the video window, or if you're watching this on your cell phone while you're out and about, you can submit them just below the video. You'll also be able to find recordings of our webinars on our website, New Zealand Post website, and you can register for upcoming webinars there as well. So otherwise, welcome Sam and Jeff. It's great to have you with us today. Jeff, let's start with you. Can you tell me a little bit more about ThinkStep ANZ and what's your role there?
Sure. So my colleague Barbara likes to describe ThinkStep ANZ as being a group of translators. We translate the language of sustainability into the language of business. And so we're trying to translate all the warm and fuzzy things that are associated with sustainability, trying to measure them and trying to make them real in a business setting. My role is as technical director, and I look at a lot of our product and corporate sustainability work and trying to link the two together. So right from the level of sustainability strategy down to the level of the really hard numbers around assessing, is option A or option B better, or what should our business be doing to decarbonise, that sort of thing.
Cool. Okay, thank you. And Sam, can you tell me a little bit more about what sustainability means to New Zealand Post? I understand you've got some quite big goals around this.
Sure. So at New Zealand Post, we've been looking at sustainability for quite some time now, and we have an ambition to be the most sustainable brand in New Zealand. We've got targets across our three main areas, which are people, planet and prosperity. With our people area, that's about the investing in the communities in which we operate and looking at how we can support social enterprise and charities and so on. And there's an initiative called Delivering for Good, which has just been launched. In our planet piece, that's about reducing our environmental impact. That primarily at New Zealand Post is from carbon emissions, and we have some big carbon reduction goals through to 2030. And then we've got the prosperity pillar, where we look at the products and services that we provide to customers and consumers. So obviously the packaging work that we're discussing today comes under that. And we've also had a new initiative which we launched in early April, where consumer sending or person-to-person sending is now carbon neutral. So that means for all people that walk into, say, a retail outlet and would like to post a letter or a parcel domestically or overseas, we are measuring the emissions, of course taking steps to reduce them, but actually buying carbon credits for those that we haven't been able to reduce. And that's available across the board, so it's not an opt-in service, it is simply part of how we operate now.
And is the moves that you're making towards sustainable packaging helping to achieve that carbon neutral sending for people?
Yeah, so I think as we'll discuss today is that with the move to the 80% recycled content that we're making, we've actually been able to reduce emissions from our packaging range by close to 190,000 kgs. So that obviously helps reduce our carbon footprint and those of our senders.
And I understand that New Zealand Post has a goal to be carbon neutral from 2030, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So we've set a carbon neutral goal from 2030, but we've also set an ambitious science-based reduction target through to that time. So we're aiming to cut emissions by a third from our whole network between 2018 and 2030. And we're looking at that in a number of different ways.
So 2030 is not that far away, really, in the scheme of things. So can you tell us about the initiatives that you have in place to make sure that that goal is actually achieved by then, or from then?
Yeah, sure. So we're looking at everything across the business, from the buildings in which we operate and how we can make them more energy efficient, the corporate fleet, so moving our vehicles to electric vehicles, looking at our contracted fleet, helping contractors think about electric vans and what they can do, through to our heavy trucks that we operate up and down the country every day, right through to the products and services that we offer customers, such as packaging that we're here to talk about.
And so that's where ThinkStep comes in, isn't it, around this packaging. So can you tell me about your role in helping New Zealand Post figure out what sustainable packaging looks like and how we can offer that to our customers?
Yeah, so we started working together, ThinkStep and New Zealand Post, over a year ago, and the sort of initial scope was looking at, okay, well, if these are the options that are available in the market, we could look at paper, padded paper, home compostable, plastic, recycled plastic, looking at all the different options that are available for courier bags or mailers. If we look at them and we say, okay, well, let's say we're trying to deliver the same function, which might be in this case in A5 size goods, how can we possibly deliver that function with the lowest carbon footprint, the lowest environmental impact? And so really the work that we were doing was trying to quantify that. So if we're starting from the perspective of we want to send stuff from here to here, what is the lowest impact way that we can do that? And our focus in this context is really on the single-use items, even though reusable obviously is important and will be considered in the future. And I think Sam might want to talk to that again about in the future in this conversation.
And so what was the finding of that research? What material came out on top as being, the least harmful to the environment that New Zealand Post could pick up and use?
Yeah, so the key finding is that the recycled mailers, the one with 80% recycled content, recycled plastic, was the lowest impact from cradle to grave. So considering all the different environmental impacts throughout the life cycle of the product.
And I mean, were you both surprised by the fact that plastic came out on top in that way?
Yeah, well, it's certainly a surprise to a lot of people, partly myself included, just how much it was beneficial over the other options considered. So one of the reasons, as Jeff said, comparing those options is because we wanted to really have something definitive we could refer to and understand the various impacts of. And this study provided that. And I don't think any of us at New Zealand Post certainly just appreciated the benefit that recycled plastic had over all the other options.
And was that the same for you?
Yeah, I think for me, the results perhaps weren't super surprising because we've done similar analyses before, but I think from a consumer perspective they will be, because I think there's a stigma around plastic.
Yes, definitely.
People, when asked, they often name plastics in the ocean, plastics in the environment as one of their number one sustainability concerns. If we look at Conway Brunton's polls, they say that year after year after year. And I think there's this perception that plastic is this big evil thing, and it can be, but only if it gets into the environment. And I think that's always the thing. From a carbon footprint perspective, from the perspective of many other environmental indicators, plastic is a lightweight solution to a problem. And the key thing is not getting it into the environment in the first place. And I think that's where, a courier bag, something that's going door to door and not really getting out there as an on-the-go product, is something where there's a very low risk of that entry into the environment. And so then when you look at it and you look at the trade-offs, you could use paper, you could use something else, but the paper has to be much heavier to deliver the same function, to be as strong as the plastic.
And so with that stigma around plastic, Sam, did you consider that when you were looking at what was the best option for packaging for New Zealand Post and the sort of consumer reaction to that? I know there's been calls for New Zealand Post to look at, for example, compostable and paper options, and how did you kind of weigh that up?
Yeah, so that's partly why we engage ThinkStep, is actually to say, okay, looking at from end to end, from everything from the extraction of the raw material, the transport, the manufacturing, the use, and the disposal options. And only by comparing across the full life cycle could we really understand the impact. And the other thing ThinkStep did for us was actually not just look at the carbon impact, but looked at 11 or 12 other environmental indicators and how these bags and all the different types of bags compared to each other. So that helped us, again, understand the full environmental impacts of the different packaging types and showed that recycled plastic was still the best choice at the moment for us.
And so how much more is plastic the best choice? What's the margin between plastic, recycled plastic, and other options? Was it by far the winner, or was it actually quite close?
The study found is that both the recycled content bags, whether you landfill them or recycle them, are both better than the original bag. And in fact, the New Zealand made bag has less than half the carbon of the original bag that we were comparing against, which was great to see, that regardless of which option, it's still the better choice. And that gave us a lot of confidence to work with our supplier, Sealed Air, to move to those bags.
And Jeff, compared to paper, I mean, why was paper comparably so much worse?
Yeah, I know that's probably pretty surprising, but the key thing is that the paper's a lot heavier. You know,
Right.
you have to have you've got a much heavier bag to be able to package the same amount of product and keep it safe.
Yeah.
And so you've got to make a lot more material in the first place, so that's one of the key issues. And then when you're comparing it to the New Zealand recycled bag, for example, you've got the relatively clean, green, renewable New Zealand electricity grid doing the recycling of the plastic. So you've got, in the one case, a lightweight recycled thing using New Zealand electricity, and in the other case, a much heavier thing that you've got to make in Australia and then import here. And so there's a lot more going on to produce the paper bag effectively.
So, what about compostable? You know, we hear a lot of good things about compostable packaging, and we've had customers as well calling for us to introduce compostable packaging. So, how did that compare?
Yeah, unfortunately it didn't compare that well. So it's more than double the impact of the conventional bag before any changes were made, and sort of 4 or 5 times the impact of the new one that's been selected. And there's kind of a few reasons for that. So one of them, and something I didn't really appreciate until we started the study, but to make the bag, you have to have a kind of plastic binder, the thing that makes it plasticky. And that binder is currently mostly produced from oil-derived, fossil-derived plastic. And so if you think about it, you've got this plastic which is compostable, but it's not necessarily made from plants. It's made from oil. It has a starch filler, which is plant derived, but the problem is that the bulk of that material is actually fossil or oil derived. And so you've got an oil derived material which is coming out of the ground, and when it breaks down, it's being released to the air. And if it's going to composting, it's being released as carbon dioxide, which means it has a sort of lower footprint compared to if it was put in a landfill, and you might release also some methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. And so the challenge with putting a home compostable in landfill is that you kind of lose twice. So you've got this sort of higher upfront impact, and then you've got the challenge of you've got fossil derived carbon coming out of an oil well going up into the air, not as necessarily all carbon dioxide, but also some of this really potent methane as well. And so it's kind of a challenging thing for the compostables. That's not to say that compostables can't be a good solution. There's lots of cases where they are good, and where there is a risk of them in the environment, compostables make a huge amount of sense. But in the case of a courier bag, this isn't really the ideal sort of field.
So no matter what way you look at it, recycled plastic continues to come out on top.
It does, yeah. And we did consider quite a wide range of environmental indicators. So we looked at 12 different environmental indicators, of which the carbon footprint was one of them. And across 11 of the 14 indicators, the recycled New Zealand recycled bag came out best. And in the other 3, the margin that it was worse by is quite small. And so really, when you're looking at it across, like from a balanced perspective, the recycled content bag is clearly the winner from my perspective.
And it is quite a surprising result, really, isn't it? And I think a lot of our viewers today will be surprised by this result. So can you tell me a little bit more about, are you sure? How robust is this? And can you explain how you tested it?
Sure. So we follow a standard called ISO 14044, which is the International Standard for Life Cycle Assessment. And through that standard, there's a requirement that whenever you're doing making a comparative claim, like we are here, comparing lots of different options, you have to go through a review by a panel of 3 independent experts. So we contracted a review panel, completely independent of both New Zealand Post and ThinkStep. We have to write an incredibly detailed life cycle assessment study that's typically 100 plus pages, and then that goes to the review panel for them to scrutinise. And so we're paying them to criticise us, and so as a result they do. And so we have to then go through line by line and address all their critique and ensure that it meets the letter of the standard. And yeah, I mean, the results potentially are quite surprising. And I think when people have, I think, a perception of a view of certain environmental things. One of them is plastic is bad, and another one is probably that landfill is bad, and that can be true. But from a perspective of a plastic product, it's fairly inert. So you put it into a landfill and not a lot happens. Yes, it takes up space, and that's not great. And it would be better if it was recycled and enters a circular economy. But from an environmental impact perspective, what is the impact of storing something in a hole in the ground? It's not great, but it's not like there's a lot of things leaching out and gases being produced and other problems. Whereas ironically, if you take some of the other bags, the paper, the compostable, and they end up in landfill, then they are breaking down and they're producing gases like methane, which have a very high impact on the climate. And so that finding of landfill and recycling being similar only applies to the plastic bags. If you take it to the compostables and the paper that do biodegrade more readily, then you end up with very significant impacts from landfill versus the much better solution of recycling them. And so it depends a lot on how much they do break down. And because ironically the plastic doesn't break down, you don't really have the same impacts from landfilling it.
So we're sure about plastic?
We're fairly sure about plastic, yeah.
So Sam, because of this study, New Zealand Post has chosen to roll out 80% recycled plastic packaging. What's going to be the impact of that?
So first of all, what's great is that the packaging is made up of a waste product that would otherwise have gone to landfill. So by requesting this now from our suppliers, we're actually stopping some plastic waste going to the landfill. Secondly, there's a saving in carbon emissions. We've estimated that's about 190,000 kgs of emissions per year that will be avoided because of the switch to this packaging. And that's the equivalent of not taking 824 flights from Auckland to Wellington.
Yeah, that's a lot,
so
isn't it?
That does add up a lot. And what's really good as well is because of this is helping reduce our own carbon emissions, and now that we offer person-to-person sending, being carbon neutral, this is another way that it's lowering our offset requirements. So we now buy carbon credits to offset that, and we're now buying less because of this initiative.
And so when will these packaging options actually be available to customers? Are they available right now?
So currently they're rolling out into all our retail outlets, so anyone walking into one of our outlets off the street will be able to access them, and it's been rolled into the business range currently, and so by July we're expecting all of our plastic packaging to be made out of recycled content and made here in New Zealand.
So then, Jeff, what is your advice for businesses out there who are looking to move into sustainable packaging options at the moment? And I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this as well, Sam. But
yeah, my advice is always to look at the numbers, because I think you can have a belief or a perception that something would turn out to be the way that it's going to be, and then when you look at the figures and you actually kind of work through it, you find that the opposite of what you expect is true. And I think it's really worth doing that for sort of end to end, what we call cradle to grave or cradle to cradle analysis, to really look across the full life cycle and understand all the impacts, because sometimes people focus very much on what they control, but they don't think about the upstream supply chain or the downstream customer chain or whatever is happening upstream and downstream of where they are, which can have a really huge impact. And so I think it's about looking at all the different options, really assessing them across their full life and trying to sort of quantify that and then make comparisons based on facts rather than kind of feelings.
And would you agree with that, Sam?
Yeah, I'd completely agree, and I'd just, as well, for anyone looking at this, just take a step back first and consider packaging and their overall business environmental impact and how important packaging is compared to other impacts they may have. For us at New Zealand Post, our biggest impact is our transport fleet, and that's the predominant focus of my role. Packaging is important to us and our stakeholders, and that's why we've also looked at this as well. So really have a think about that. And then of course the role of packaging. Packaging is there to protect the product that you're sending, and if that product is ruined, then that has a far greater environmental impact than the packaging in the first place. So really it's about thinking quite holistically about how you're using packaging.
I think it's a really important point that Sam just mentioned there regarding the packaging versus the product, because when you look at things, people have to dispose of packaging, right? So it's in their hands and they have to make a choice. Do I put it in a bin? Do I put it in the recycling bin? Can I compost it? You've got to make that choice at the time. But as Sam was pointing out, the bigger impact is actually the thing that is being packaged. And if you damage that thing, then it was better just to have more packaging in the first place, potentially to protect it.
Because the environmental impact is so much.
Yeah, the environmental impact of the packaging might be 5% versus 95% for the product. I think people get very caught up on the packaging, which is important and needs to be dealt with, absolutely, don't get me wrong. And we've certainly got issues with plastics, and we've got all kinds of other issues we have to deal with. But I think the thing is that people are very focused on that one area, and they're not necessarily looking at the bigger picture of everything else and the way we live and work as a society. And they're not necessarily just going back through that whole value chain and thinking, okay, well, how did this thing get made? How did it get to me? How do I travel around? What's my diet? All these lots of other questions that you could be asking yourself, which are possibly more important than that one. And not to say it's irrelevant, but just that there are lots of other big questions when we're coming to addressing environmental issues that we need to consider.
Yeah, and that's why that New Zealand Post will still offer, for instance, cardboard boxes to send things in, because although they do have a bigger environmental footprint, for some people that's what they need to protect the products that they're sending. So we make sure that the boxes that we do provide are as environmentally friendly as we can, made from recycled content, not using bleachers and so on. So it's about doing choosing the best options that you can for when you do need to use packaging.
And what about businesses who are experiencing pressure at the moment from sort of public and customer and media noise around packaging or other materials that they might be using in their business? What advice do you have for how to navigate that around trying to do the right thing and also meet customer demand?
Yeah, it's a really tough balance, and it's one we're constantly looking at from everything from delivering things in EVs with the technology available at the moment through to packaging, and really it's about being really clear, I think, about what you're trying to achieve, what is your pathway to getting there, and doing the actions that you can now, but not saying you're finished. So this packaging piece of work is correct for us now, but now we're starting to look at, okay, what's next? We still have a goal to provide 100% recyclable, reusable or compostable packaging by 2025. So at the moment we're at an 80% recycled content bag. Mm-hmm. There's still work to do. There's still options around reusable packaging we need to start to look at. So yeah, we're not finished.
And so the report that we're referring to now and the research that we've just been talking about, where can people read this? Is it available publicly?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's available on the New Zealand Post website, so you can go and download it. As part of meeting the standards that we're following here, the report itself has to be public. And also equally in that, there's also all of the critique and commentary back from the review panel and our responses to it. So there's quite a lot of detail available, as well as a short form summary of the report as well, for those who don't want all the detail.
And Sam, would you recommend that our customers watching today check out the report?
Yeah, we've both got a 2-page summary. But if they want to read the full report, it's also on our website for those that really want to dive in deeper.
Cool, and I just have one final question for you, Sam. You mentioned earlier in the chat that New Zealand Post has a goal to reduce carbon emissions by 32%. So how are you going and tracking against that so far?
Yeah, it's quite challenging at the moment, especially as New Zealand Post experiences quite a lot of parcel growth, which means obviously that we need to put on more transport and more vans and bigger sorting depots. But what's good is that we have identified what needs to change where and are really targeting those areas, especially our last mile fleet. And we've even providing incentives for our contractors to switch into EVs where we'll actually help fund them. So, you know, like I said, with some of these things, it's about thinking about where the biggest environmental impact is and keeping your eye on that, and that's where we're going.
So are you on track though?
We're on track, yes, but it's going to be quite a challenge through, but we are committed to it, and I know that the business is committed to it.
Awesome. Well, those are all the questions that I have for you both. Thank you so much for your time today. This has been really interesting, and I personally have learned quite a lot. So thanks everyone for joining us today. It's been wonderful to have you. I really hope that you've also learned a lot. It's been, you know, the research is quite surprising, and if you do have time to check it out on the New Zealand Post website, I recommend you do so. We'd love to hear your feedback around what topics you'd like to cover with our webinars in the future. There's a survey just below the video window, and we'd love to hear from you. We want to make sure that these webinars are really beneficial and valuable to you and your business. We will be sending out a recording of this webinar to you all early next week, and then you can also watch all of our webinars on the New Zealand Post website. Our next webinar is scheduled for Friday the 11th of June, where we're going to talk about our 10-year plan to transform our delivery network and how this investment will benefit you and your customers. So we're really looking forward to sharing our progress on that. But for now, mā te wā, see you next time.